Hello, it's Alex and welcome to Hey Little Thrifter. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in September, and I had a pretty good reading month actually. I ended up reading 5 books, which I know isn't a ton, but for me that's quite a lot. I probably normally average about 3 books a month. First up I read Carrie by Stephen King, and I got this one from the library, so I've already returned it, so I don't have my copy anymore. But this is one of Stephen King's most famous ones. I believe it was the first of his that he actually had published, and it was made into a film in the 70s, which is fantastic. And I had seen the film a couple of times, so I was already familiar with the story and the characters, but I had never read the book, so I was really excited to read it. As a side note, I have actually started up a book club here in Pittsburgh, and it is a horror book club, so each month we're reading a horror novel and then meeting up to discuss it over a drink. So this is for people that live in Pittsburgh. It isn't an online discussion type book club, but if you live here and you would like to join us, then please do. I will leave a link to our group page on Facebook down below. So yeah, Carrie was the first book that we chose to read for the horror book club, and I think it was a good selection. It's one that has kind of been on my radar somewhat for a while, and it seemed like a good place to start. So Carrie tells the story of a girl called Carrie who is at high school, and she is, you know, the freak of the class. She has no friends, she's bullied a lot, and she is brought up in a very religious household. Her mother's very overbearing and kind of protects her and shelters her from the world. And throughout the book we learn more about Carrie and her mother and their relationship, and we also learn about what Carrie has to deal with on a daily basis at school, being bullied and not fitting in. We also learn a bit more about some of the other students at the school and some of the teachers. And as the story progresses, we learn that Carrie has telekinesis, which means she can move things with the power of her mind. And the bullying and the telekinesis basically culminates in a rather horrific finale. And I did enjoy reading this, but unfortunately not nearly as much as I thought I would. I think the story itself is absolutely brilliant. It's a great premise, and I just think the actual storytelling let it down a bit, and it is quite a short book, but even so I felt it was quite slow. The story is also interspersed with stuff like news articles and interviews, and I've seen this concept work really well in other novels, but for me at least it didn't work in this one. It just felt like really stilted and disjointed with this constant back and forth between those things and the story. I did like it, just not as much as I thought I would, so I gave it 3.5 stars out of 5. Next up I read The Devil's Wedding Ring by Vidar Sundstol. I got this for free from NetGalley and read it on my Kindle. This is a Norwegian book translated by Tina Nunnally. It tells the story of Max, who used to be a policeman in a small Norwegian town, but for the most of his life he's been living in the US, and he finds out that one of his friends who he used to work with in the police force back in Norway has passed away, and the two haven't seen each other for like 30 odd years, but he, you know, remembers him fondly and wants to go back for his funeral. So Max is back in Norway for the funeral of his old friend Nut, and he soon begins to think that the supposed suicide was actually not a suicide, and he thinks there was something else going on and that he might have been murdered. The premise of this story really interested me. The title grabbed my attention, and then when I read a bit more about it, I thought, okay, that sounds great, sign me up. It said that it was all about Norwegian folklore and ancient pagan rituals, and you know, with this murder mystery as well. So that sounded great, and it definitely had its moments, but overall it just wasn't that great, unfortunately. I enjoyed it somewhat, but it was kind of forgettable. I thought the main character, Max, was unfortunately fairly boring. I think the writer did try to have this interesting backstory about him, but I just, you know, wasn't really that interested in him as a character. One thing that I found difficult reading this was that there are quite a lot of characters and quite a lot of different places and locations, and they're all in Norwegian, so I did find it a bit tough at times to keep up with all of this and remember who was who and where we were and what we were doing. I did find it easier as the book goes along, but it was something that was difficult to begin with. Another thing I didn't really like was there's a couple of kind of rather sexist comments in here which didn't really sit right with me. It's not as though they were there to imply something about a particular character, that, you know, they were a sexist person, or that it was to open up some kind of discussion about sexism. It was just some really sexist comments in there, and for no real reason. So that was a bit awkward and I felt unnecessary. Saying that, on the flip side, the most interesting character in the book for me was the female character who becomes Max's sidekick. Her name was Thornhill, and I thought she was great. I thought she was quite well written, she was interesting, and I really enjoyed reading about her and her involvement in this case. So yeah, bit of a weird combination there. So although this book had a really interesting premise, it just didn't quite live up to my interest level. So unfortunately I don't think I'm going to be rushing out to read any more of his stuff, which is a shame. And I gave this one 3 stars out of 5. Next up, I finished the final book in the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. Yes! It's been a long time coming. I have actually been reading this over the past few months. I've kind of read it like a third at a time, so it's taken me a while, but I think that ended up being a good strategy for me to read a longer book like this, is to, you know, just read a portion of it, then put it down for a little while, read something else, and then come back to it and carry on. And overall, I really enjoyed this. To begin with, I had a hard time getting into it. It has been quite a few years probably since I read the book prior to this one in the series, so it took me a while to get back into all of the characters and what was going on in the storyline. But once I did, I really enjoyed it. It was really awesome to get back into their story and all of the adventures that these characters are going on and seeing where they all end up. And obviously don't want to give any spoilers away, but it was a fantastic read. I really enjoyed it. It did get a bit slow in places, and there were certain things that just weren't quite as interesting to me as other parts of the book, but yeah, like I say, overall it was great, and I gave it 4 stars out of 5. Next up, I read Ugly Girls by Lindsay Hunter, and I got this copy from the library and I probably need to return it soon. And this one I heard about from Natasha on My Reading Is Odd. I will link the video where she talked about this down below, and yeah, go check her out, she's awesome. And this tells the story of 2 teenage girls, Perry and Baby Girl, and it deals with their friendship, it deals with their respective families and their relationships there. This is realistic, it is gritty and a bit grimy, and it's not an uplifting story in the slightest. It's fairly dark and depressing, and I thought it was brilliant. I loved her writing, I loved the story and the characters. Basically, they're each dealing with their own problems and each other's problems, and none of them are living a great life. You know, we're talking about violence and stealing and alcoholism and just stuff that real people deal with. It was very well written and intriguing and compelling. It is somewhat similar to like a Larry Clark or a Harmony Korine film. Maybe not quite as extreme as they sometimes go, but definitely that kind of gritty portrayal was somewhat similar. So yeah, again, I don't want to say too much about what happens in the story, but I highly recommend it. I believe she has written some short story collections, so I'm interested to check those out one day. And yeah, I love this one. I gave it 4 stars out of 5. And finally, I read Thornhill by Pam Smy. This was another one I got from my library. This one is a YA story / graphic novel, and the author is also an illustrator, so she has written and illustrated the whole thing, and it is told part in graphic novel format and part in like diary entries. And I'm going to put this down because it's really heavy. And it tells the story of a young girl called Mary who is living in an orphanage in 1982, and we are reading her diary entries, and she is confiding about her being bullied in the orphanage and at school, and the people in care at the orphanage just don't seem to either notice what's going on or they don't want to do anything about it. And it was genuinely sad in a couple of places. I really did feel for her and the things that she was dealing with. The second part of the story is told through the illustrations, and this follows another young girl called Ella, and she moves into a new house and she can see the orphanage, which is called Thornhill, I should say. She can see Thornhill from her bedroom, and she becomes intrigued in the place. She sneaks into the grounds and she ends up looking into what happened there. I thought this was okay, but I was under the impression that this was like a spooky tale, and that's why I thought it would be perfect for this time of year, but it wasn't really. It was just a kind of a sad story, and then like they tried to make it spooky at the end. I realise this is written for younger people, so maybe someone younger would have a totally different take on it than myself, but I just felt it was an interesting premise, and I did like the way that it was portrayed. The 1982 period being told through diary entries, and then the present day period being told purely through illustrations. I thought that was very cool, but there was just something about the story that I just felt was kind of long-winded, and then when it wrapped up at the end, it was just like, oh, like literally in the last few pages it suddenly completely changes tack. And you're like, oh, was there any hint of that in the other 95% of the book? No, there wasn't. As I was reading it, I was thinking there was a couple of ways that the story could be going, and I thought they were quite interesting, but it didn't actually turn out that way, and I just thought so much more could have been done here, and I didn't think the storytelling was very good. When I finished it, I gave it 3 stars out of 5 because I thought it was okay, it was pretty good for what it was. But then the more I thought about it, the more things bugged me, and I ended up giving it 2 stars out of 5. So ending the month on a bit of a bum note, but at least it was a quick read. So that was everything I read in September. Have you read anything cool this month? Let me know. The next book that we're reading for the horror book club is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I've never read that and I'm really looking forward to a bit of gothic horror, so I will tell you all about my thoughts on that next month. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and hopefully I will see you again in my next video. Bye!